Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tueller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on April 27th with Maureen Brady. She will be giving a presentation entitled Using Newspapers to Fill in the Gaps in a Family Story. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on Crossing the Border, Finding Your Immigrant Ancestors. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James has over 40 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 18 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And if James is ready, we can go ahead and turn the time over to him.
Well, welcome everyone to another BYU Family History Library webinar. Today we're going to talk about Crossing the Border, Finding Your Immigrant Ancestors. I've tried to use some of the some older pictures. Primarily these come from the Library of Congress, and they have quite a collection of interesting photos. So first of all, just to kind of set the stage here, everyone in the United States is ultimately descended from an immigrant, including Native Americans. They may not know who the immigrant ancestors were or how many years ago it was, but almost everyone uniformly agrees that even the Native American people were immigrants from other parts of the world. Well, this presents quite a bit of a challenge to all of us who are doing our genealogy, because we ultimately, if our ancestors came from somewhere else, either run out of records or we run into an immigrant who came to America or to wherever you happen to be living. And so it's very common. Some of the people around the world, of course, will find records running out long before they find where their people came from. They essentially consider themselves to be from that location, so that's something different. Here in the United States, then we are a nation of immigrants, and we're going to have to look at that regardless of how much genealogy we do. Eventually, if we do enough, we'll run into an immigrant. So what is the biggest challenge? I have, over the past couple of years, been doing consultations for the Salt Lake Family Search Library. And they have 20-minute consultations that people can sign up from. And people have been signing up from all over the world. And out of all those I've done so far, I've scheduled more than 600 of those consultations. And I would guess, and I'm not going to have an actual percentage, but very high percentage, over 90%, more than probably 95% of all of the consultations and the main questions that I've gotten so far for over those 600 has to do with the origin place of the immigrant. And so it really is one of the big challenges. Now, if you just happen to have an immigrant line and the person recorded exactly where they came from and or already have records from where your immigrant came from, then you're basically saved, at least on that line, from confronting this issue. But it's very common and we'll see a lot of reasons why that's the case, that the place of origin of the immigrant is the mystery. It's the one big issue that has to be solved in order for anybody to make any progress past that particular person in their ancestry. Here is the general rule, and I repeat this rule I can't even imagine how many times I've said this, and that is research for the immigrant always begins in the country of arrival, not the country of departure. But there's kind of a condition here. Unless you already have the exact location of an event and it's known about the country of departure. So if you already have that information, then the idea of tracing the immigrant is, of course, kind of a moot point. Excuse me. But as I mentioned, that may be just one of your lines. In other words, you may be fortunate enough to know where one of your immigrant ancestors came from. There's hardly any exceptions that it turns out to be at least difficult, if not, even if you have a place where the immigrant ancestor comes from. In one of my lines and one of my great-grandparents, it turns out that they didn't record it properly. And so when you went to look for records from that place, the place did not exist. And it took years and years of other research to discover records that showed the actual point of origin, where these people came from originally. So one thing, though, that is fairly common is to be able to find the port of departure. And it's interesting that I'll talk in a moment about passenger lists and manifests and all of those kinds of travel records of those getting to America. But many times people, when they came to the country, were asked, where did you come from? And they said, Hamburg, Germany, Hamburg, or Liverpool, or Seville, or Barcelona, or wherever. So they came from someplace, and they said that those places were the people who start to do research often consider that to be where they lived. But that's not the case. Those were the ports. And it's like if you said, where did you come from? And you were just getting off of a boat, you'd probably say you came from wherever the boat left. But instead of asking, where did you live? What is your point of origin? Where were you born? The information that's recorded on most of these records, almost universally, is the port of departure. So another part of understanding immigration, as particularly here in the United States and with similar types of laws throughout the world, is that immigration and immigration laws, knowing about these laws can help you find your ancestors. The reason why is that, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the time period and depending on the country, the countries have recorded information about their immigrants and or their immigrants. Now, immigration is coming into a country, so you immigrate and come into as an immigrant into the United States. And emigration is leaving. So if you were living in or were born in Ireland or England or Germany or someplace, you would emigrate from Germany or Ireland. So both records in some cases have been kept. So you may be able to find an immigration record or a record of a person coming into the country of arrival. And you may also find an exit information coming from the country of departure. So there may be records there that will help you find where they immediately came from. So let's look a little bit more here. One thing about immigration laws is that they change regularly and frequently. I was an attorney. I worked as a trial attorney primarily in Arizona. And one time I became interested in, because I speak Spanish fluently, I became interested in investigating whether I would like to do some immigration law, like tell people I did immigration law. And that's helping immigrants once they come into the country to gain citizenship or to get a permanent visa or something of that nature. Okay, so that's the kind of thing lawyers get involved in. I soon found out after talking to people who were actually involved in immigration law that it was something that changed so often that they had binders of book for their law books. They, instead of having a law book or a reference book that told them about the law, they got notification every day, literally, of whatever had changed in whatever part of the immigration law that they needed to know about. And I decided that that was almost as bad or worse than doing tax law. So I decided taxes change every day. So does immigration. What does this do for a genealogist? Well, part of the problem is that by not understanding immigration, how immigration occurs and the process of immigration in any particular time period can keep you from finding the proper records. So you may end up without knowing the history and without knowing the details of what laws were in force and what kinds of things were being considered, that you may be looking for something that isn't there. In other words, you may constantly try to find, for instance, a naturalization record and not realizing that there was different times that those records were actually generated and who generated and where the records were generated. So this history and the knowledge of some of the not the actual details, but the consensus of and how the immigration laws were being applied during any particular period of time is something that you've got to know. And if you don't know that, then you'll basically end up doing this, looking for somebody who appears to be invisible, and you're very frustrated because you can't find anything at all about this person or where they came from. So, and to effectively research the records, you have to know what the law was at the time that the records were created, because the different records were created at different times depending on depending on what law was in force and effect. And the laws kept changing all the time, just constantly. Almost every year, every few months, there was another law and some changes in the law. And if you listen to the news, you'll find out that this process is still going on. The laws on immigration constantly change. And mainly one of the main things that changes are what's called the quotas. The quotas are the number of people from any particular country that the United States is going to allow to immigrate during any particular period. And these are negotiated and changeable. And so you, without knowing what that kind of effect that might have on the time and place of your person's immigration, then basically you are looking for something that may not be there. Now, kind of to understand, this is the way that this worked here in America, in the United States, and in Canada, and most of all of the American, both North and South America. When people started coming in the 1600s and 1500s and 1600s, there were no immigration laws. There was no law here that regulated how many people came in or when they came in or how they came in. And until the mid-1800s in the United States, there were no immigration laws as such. There were naturalization laws, but there were no immigration laws. And a person could simply walk, ride a horse, ride a wagon, come in a ship, or any other way of getting to the country and just walk in. And nobody took notice of the fact that they had come across the border. No one cared. And there were no records. And so when you start getting back into finding these people, once again, you may be looking for something that doesn't exist. If you think that there was a record kept of how and when the person came. Now, that may not be the case in some locations, and there are exceptions. And a very large number of people came to America through certain specific ports. They were people who came because they came on a boat, and the boat docked in one of the major cities. So you have places of arrival, and the two biggest ones obviously were Ellis Island and Capital, and now that went out of my head. It'll come back to me. The other one on the edge of Manhattan and in New York. So through a very high number of people came to the United States through New York, and those records were kept back into the 1800s of arrival records. The problem that they had was that most of the time, the place that they recorded as being the place where these people came from was very similar to that happens in U.S. Census records. When they had a U.S. Census record and a person was speaking a language that they perceived to be German, they said this person came from Germany. And that didn't matter, even if it happened before Germany became an entity, an actual place. Germany became when the German Empire began, and that was around 1871. So before that, there's no such place as Germany. There was Austro-Hungary, there was Prussia, there was all sorts of different places and all little other organizations for princes and dukes and things like that. But none of those were German, and the records are all very difficult to sort out because the time and where these people came from. But uniformly, people will walk in, for instance, to the library or contact me through the consultants or otherwise and say, my ancestors came from Germany in 1850. And I'll say, well, yeah, no, because Germany didn't exist in 1850. So where did they really come from? Well, they came from Westphalia, or they came from Württemberg, or they came from Prussia, or they came from Bavaria, or they came from someplace, but they didn't come from Germany. And so that's kind of the rude awakening, I would say, to a lot of people as they begin to look for this. But here's the key, and this is what this slide is about. Before the mid-1800s, we're talking up until around 1850, a huge percentage of the people who came to America came either as transported people, meaning they were arrested in wherever they were and shipped over to the United States, to America. And until the United States was formed and organized legally by 1782, and started to have laws, those people were just shipped here and dumped here. And indentured people were the same. An indenture was a contract to come over and work for a period of years. And people got here to America by signing those contracts and coming and obligating themselves to work for a specific person for up to 7 years. Or they were enslaved people. And if we look at those people, we'll see that enslaved people began to be imported to America around 1619. So just shortly after when the first settlers from England got to America and to Spain and wherever to the Americans, the people they brought with them were enslaved people. So there were people who were enslaved people from the earliest times of settlement from European settlement in America. And then the second group of people were indentured servants, and the indentured servants were usually young people and young men, but not all young men. There were times in England where basically what they would do would be to enforce, women were very much constrained in English society. And if a younger woman was out on the street, even if she was legitimately on the street, or whatever she was, for whatever reason she was there, she stood the danger of being arrested and put on a ship and shipped to America. And there were thousands of women who were shipped over to America, and up to 75% of all the individuals who came off the transatlantic ships in the 17th century, that's the 1600s, were indentured servants. And a fairly high percentage of them in the 1700s were indentured servants. And there were whole organizations of settlement and law that were based on the concept of indentured servants, particularly in Georgia. If you have ancestors who lived in Georgia, in what's now the state of Georgia, and in the earliest days, and into following the colonization and the establishment of the United States, many land speculations and things were based on what was called the Georgia headright system. And the headright system was that a person who had some influence or some capital or money to get some land, or political connections, could get up to 1,000 acres of land. And all they had to do is agree to take X number of indentured servants to work on their land. And so they just, it was a way by which a large portion of Georgia was settled. And what happened to these indentured people? Well, many of them could not read or write, and I can make some assumptions about them after having researched for years and years. But one of the first things is that they necessarily weren't coming with their correct names. In other words, just because they said their name was John Brown or Robert Peterson or whatever name they chose did not mean that was actually their name. There was no way to tell what their actual name was back in England. And so there's lots of things, and I'll get into the differences that happens. And these are the challenges that face the researching those immigrants. And think about it. If 7 out of 10 of the immigrants that came to America came as one of these categories of indentured servants or enslaved people or transported people, there's no guarantee. In fact, there's not even a presumption that the information that they gave about their origin was correct. And it's also very, very possible that other things occurred. First of all, they may have completely anglicized or changed their names. So if they did come from someplace that was non-English speaking, it was in their interest not to be associated with that place. If we think that prejudice about immigrants is something that is a contemporary problem, it was a problem from 1620 with the Pilgrims, the first Pilgrims. Because as soon as somebody else came, they became the immigrant, and that started the whole process. So there was a great, particularly among immigrants who perhaps came from a place that was less desirable. For example, when the United States was at war with Germany, it was a highly likely that the person with the German name ended up by translating their name into English or taking an English name so that they weren't automatically associated with the enemy, with Germany or whoever else they were fighting with at the time. Secondly, the immigrants may have assimilated and abandoned their original culture. So even though the people may have come from Ireland, for example, their children may quickly have decided that they didn't want to be Irish, they wanted to be Americans, and they did dropped everything that had to do with their original culture. Now, this didn't happen with every single person. These are not uniform situations. These are the very, very likely things that make it extremely difficult to find the origin of an immigrant ancestor. And the next one is the immigrants may have moved to a destination that's far removed from the port of their arrival. Okay, so let's say they came through New York. The first records you find is they're living in Wisconsin, or they're living in Michigan, or they're living in Iowa, or they're living in, and any connection between that person and a record showing someone coming into the country with a name that might be different than that person's name is one of the challenges of determining when and if they came into the country. Now, if you know when they came, or you have records or traditions in the family that may tell you some information and give you help with that situation, but it's not impossible that the information that you got transmitted through your family was completely wrong. And I've encountered that more times than you might want to guess. The immigrants may have entered the country without any documentation. Does that sound familiar? I mean, we still have that as a major issue today. And back in the time periods that we're talking about, if we keep going back in time to the 1800s and the 1700s, when we get back before the late 1800s, we're talking about not even having a requirement for documentation. There was nothing they needed to do to come into the country except to walk across the border or come across the border. So from practical standpoints, the earliest records of the immigrants come from ship manifests and passenger lists. So here's a list of the passengers on the Mayflower in 1620. These are the ones that came and survived enough to have some children and some descendants. So just in case the word manifest is not familiar to you, a manifest or customs manifest or cargo document, it's listing the the passengers, the crew of a ship or aircraft or a vehicle for the use of customs. So it's a customs document. They may not have cared if the people came into the country, but they did care if certain other items came into the country because there were taxes and restrictions. So basically, from the very earliest times, it was not unusual to have a tax. In fact, one of the motivating factors for the American Revolution, of course, was a tea tax. And that was one of the things that happened that created the situation for the American Revolutionary War. So what we have is a lot of different cultural, governmental, all sorts of different things that occurs about the immigrant. Unfortunately, the passenger lists and manifests seldom contain any mention of the place where your ancestor lived. If anything, it'll tell the port of departure, where they came from originally. That may be helpful and it may not be helpful. It depends on how far they traveled in the country of departure or where they came from. So, for example, a very common example is Hamburg, Germany, and Liverpool, England. Mainly, most of the transoceanic boats at the time were left from either of those two ports. And so a huge number of people came from those ports to America, but on the other hand, only a very, 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 very small percentage of them actually lived in either Liverpool or in Hamburg, Germany. But they can help confirm who came and where they landed. And in some cases, it may take some kind of extrapolation to find out how the name was, how their name, what their name was when they got to America. And that would be sometimes quite difficult because they may have chosen a name in English that had nothing at all to do with their original name. Instead of Schmidt for German, they changed their name to Smith, but that's very common. But in other cases, the change name when they came to America may have been deliberate. For example, with a transported person or an indentured person, they came to America and they had an agreement to be in that category for a period of time as they came to America. But what happens is that when they got here, they found out that it wasn't like England. They weren't going to pick you up on the street if you went to some other town. In a lot of cases, but in some cases, yes. And eventually they would be able to decide that they're going to have a different name. And since nobody really knew their name to start out with, that was fairly simple to do. And there was no formal legal process for changing a name. You just simply have to say, my name is not, it's this new name that you wanted. Okay, so until the late 1800s, there were no laws governing immigration. Just, I mean, think on that. Think about that a minute. One of the biggest controversies in every age of the United States has been immigration. And it's no different today. And we still argue about it. We still have polarity of opinions about immigration and how it should be handled and who should be allowed in and who shouldn't be allowed in. And if you're wondering what this thing is with the upside down word Mexico, this is a border marker. This is actually the border between Mexico and the United States. And on that line, on the top part of the line, if you're standing on that side, you're in Mexico. If you're standing on this side, on the side that says US, then you're in the United States. This is the physical markers on the ground that show where the border is between the United States and Mexico, regardless of what other kinds of barriers and things have been put up on the border. So there's a relationship between becoming to the country and becoming a citizen of the country. Okay, so a citizen would have certain rights in the United States. So if you came to the United States and you gained citizenship, you could, in a lot of cases, own property, you could vote, you could do a lot of different things, many of things of which were not allowed to people who had not gained citizenship. So it wasn't a situation that they were all immigrants and all treated the same way. It was those who complied with the laws from the institution of the United States in 1790 of the Naturalization Act, and that established who could be a citizen of the United States if they came from a foreign country, a different country. So they would prevent, and the earliest were very simple, and they would permit free whites of good character with 2 years residence in the United States to become naturalized citizens. And also children who were born outside the United States to US citizens were also considered natural born. And that's still partly the case, but it's no longer limited to free whites of good character with 2 years residence, because the rest of these people were not allowed in. Over time, some of the restrictions changed. African Americans were given citizenship in 1870 through a constitutional amendment. Native Americans did not get citizenship and the right to vote until 1924. If you think about that. Now, obviously, that's just almost 100 years ago. But for that first 300 years of the existence of the United States and the British and the colonies, Native Americans had no citizenship rights and had no rights to vote. So when you start to understand kind of this complexity of the law and who was chosen to be citizens and who wasn't chosen to be citizens, it gets to be quite complicated. And specific restrictions for certain classes of people, such as criminals, people with contagious diseases, polygamists, and others, began about 1875. So up until 1875, everybody could come into the country. And then about that time, the people that were already here decided that they weren't going to allow certain types of people into the country. Now, when you see criminals listed first, you need to remember that during the colonial period, England particularly, and Great Britain were taking their arrested criminals, the convicted criminals, and shipping them to the United States in tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And so the people who were here, many people, if you know a little bit about some of the countries of the world, and you know that Australia, the Australians celebrate the fact that they were transported, that many of their ancestors, the original founders of Australia, were all criminals sent to Australia by the English government. Not all, but fairly substantial number of them. Well, we had exactly the same thing happening here in the United States. The difference is we as Americans, people from the United States, want to forget that and don't want anybody to know about it. So even though if you're a successful genealogical researcher and you research your genealogy back, all you're going to find out is that your ancestor suddenly appears in, fill in the blank, Pennsylvania, any one of the colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, wherever, it just shows up and they just appear here magically. But what they don't ever say, and what you don't get the records of, is that these people were transported. They were arrested in England or Scotland or Wales or Ireland and shipped to America on a ship and just dumped here in America. So that's kind of the situation. And you'll see this this photo back from 1890. I mean, not photo, but the image here from 1890. And the man who is a judge is saying to Uncle Sam, if immigration was properly restricted, you would no longer be troubled with anarchy, socialism, and the mafia and such kindred evils. That's from 1790. Does it sound like anything you might hear today? And the first actual law against a certain class of people, in this case Chinese, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And that was the first significant law restricting immigration at the United States. Up until 1882, as I mentioned, everybody could just walk in. There was no reason, nothing you could do about it. It's Castle Garden. Thanks for somebody to get my mental block there. So Castle Gardens is the name of the other port of entry in New York. It was at where the Battery is, down at the tip of Manhattan. Okay, so what should we do? So when I say we look for records in the place of arrival, not the place of departure, obviously we don't know the place of departure, so we're looking in the place of arrival. And we're looking for records that the immigrant may have created after their arrival. The one biggest mystery that I confronted, other than the ones that I have failed to find any information at all about, is my great grandfather, who was recorded as having been born or come from a place in Ireland, which, by the way, as I mentioned, didn't exist. And the only way that I was able to find that after years and years of research was a marriage record that he had, where he had filled in the information of his birthplace. And it was far different. It was different than the information that the family had preserved and published and all sorts of things over the years. So once we did that, unfortunately, in this case, it didn't help a whole lot, because we still don't have any records that show, even from that place, who he was or where he came from. So another thing to kind of remember is that in the 1800, in 1800, 90% of the US population was involved in agriculture. And so there's a connection here. And the reason this is something that you should be aware of as part of the history is that your ancestors, 9 times out of 10, were farmers, or lived on farms, or were involved in farming of some kind. And if they were indentured servants, they were living on somebody's plantation, or they were involved with somebody's farm. And as you get looking at the early census records, they still have that listed. You'll have the name of the family members, and then you'll say farmhand, or whatever, depending on the size or complexity of the farm that your ancestors had. So understanding that these farm laborers, the ones who were listed on these census records, became somebody's great-grandfather or whatever. And so that's why we find that this information is helpful and somewhat, let's call it, in the higher level of difficulty of doing the research, because there is no real connection between that person and anyone else in the country. Now, there's a cutoff date, and some of these dates are very crucial. The 1882 date is crucial because that's the date before there were any kind of immigration laws. The next date that's really important has to do with naturalization, becoming a citizen in the United States. And that was 1906, because before 1906, there were no uniform rules about naturalization. So what's important about naturalization? Well, naturalization records are helpful to the extent that they had information about the origin of the immigrant. If they just do what the census record did and say they came from Ireland or England or Germany or Switzerland or wherever, that does not help us a whole lot. But at beginning in 1906, the federal courts took over. Legislation was passed transferring all naturalizations to the federal court system. So over the course of 1906, the state courts, who had all that beforehand, transferred that information to the federal courts. And the federal courts immediately began asking more questions. This was in part of the same process that had been started with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, because now the United States all of a sudden realized that they would have some control over who was coming into the country, and those people who wished to control that particular segment of the population were very vociferous and got laws passed constantly to limit one group or another from coming into the country. Now, we sometimes think that had to do with what you call undesirable aliens, people who came to the United States because they were huddled masses yearning to be free. But on the other hand, most of the majority of people who were people who were small landowners, wanted to own land, and became small landowning farmers, or became rich and made a lot of money. So It was simply a matter of deciding which group was undesirable during which period of time in the country, and which group would be let in. Excuse me. So when all those, and until all those naturalization actions were moved to the federal court, every single state had its own different process for citizenship. Some of them were very simple, some of them were a little more complicated, but generally speaking, all they had to do was renounce allegiance to their former ruler, whoever, king, duke, whoever, and then swear citizenship to the United States. And in tracking this down, and part of the research that I was doing on my Northern Irish immigrant, is that I found the naturalization records that came through, and they were sitting in the city court of the city archives of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And once we waited and got the records and were able to get a copy of the record of the naturalization record, unfortunately, all it says is that they came from Ireland. So sometimes those the district court records are the state court records are not very helpful. The district court records over time became very much more complicated, and so they became the actual go-to records. And they're if the origin of the immigrant is the objective, then it's and they became a naturalized citizen after 1906. It is very likely that the place they actually lived or were born was recorded. So that is sort of the key process to finding this. Unfortunately, even finding those records can be an interesting process, but that's another story. So just to kind of reemphasize that, prior to 1906, the content of the immigration records varied with the state of arrival and settlement. So it didn't really matter if wherever they ended up is where the law applied when they applied for citizenship to the United States. And of course, who was allowed to become a citizen became a fairly substantial issue as the law changed constantly. So you may, and they have quotas on the number of immigrants that could come from certain areas of the world. And so if you weren't in the quota, then you didn't get citizenship, or you didn't even get into the United States. So always look for a naturalization record after 1906. And if you have a federal census, that's the key to this question here. In 1870, 1900, 1910, and 1920, the arrival date and the status of the naturalization, if it says AL, that means alien, and that means they were not yet a citizen. If it says NA, that means naturalized. That means there is a naturalization record. And the key here is determining, and also the federal census lists the date of arrival, which also is helpful in finding the ship's passenger lists and manifests. But so you're looking here for information about the ancestor, and it's right there in the census records of when they became a citizen. So you should be going and getting finding the naturalization records. Now, if you were looking for naturalization records in all the different states and different courts and around the district courts, the best way to get into that whole process is to use the Family Search Research Wiki for immigration and emigration in all of the states of the United States and the federal government. There's an extensive history and lists of all of the documents and the locations of the documents that you need to find the naturalization records. And hopefully the actual origin of the ancestor has been recorded and you're on your way to doing some research in another country. Now, a woman's citizenship was tied to her husband's citizenship until 1922. So in other words, what you're going to see on the census records before that is that there's a naturalization for the husband, but there's nothing mentioned about anybody else in the family. Well, that's because they were always considered to be citizens by virtue of the fact of the husband, which, by the way, they could not vote. Women did not have the right to vote. They don't have a lot of rights that they have today. And so this was just a symptom of what was going on nationally. So one thing that did happen, though, and this is an interesting issue that you may run across, because it sometimes what you see in the records, in the census records, don't make sense. And that is, in 1907, Congress, the United States Congress, passed the Expatriation Act. And that said that any U.S. women who married a non-citizen were no longer U.S. citizens. And that actually happened to one of my wife's ancestors. She married someone from England, and that automatically made her a non-citizen. So she was no longer a citizen of the United States, could not vote by virtue of the fact she wasn't a citizen, and didn't have any of the rights of a citizen. Figure that out. But if this husband later became a naturalized citizen, then they could apply for naturalization. That was kind of them. They actually did that. And also, none of these rules applied to American men when they chose a spouse. So if a man married a wife who was a non-citizen, it didn't affect his citizenship at all. That lasted until about 1922 and was partially overruled, but it didn't actually get completely done and finished until women got the right to vote and the right to own property in their own name, and all of the other things that happened with the suffragettes and all of those. Now, as a matter of note here, beginning in 1891, border crossing records were kept from Mexico and Canada. Okay, as I mentioned, there was no record before that time. They just simply walked into the country or rode a horse into the country, whatever it was, walked across the bridge into the United States from Mexico, or came off a boat. And they were checked in kind of peremptorily, and then that was the end of it. You just disappeared into the country. So but these interesting laws, the border crossing records, I have found them to have the actual place where the immigrant lived. And particularly for Mexican citizens who came to the United States, very often you'll find the town where they left in Mexico. And so these can be extremely valuable records, and they should be searched. The rest of these immigration records are scattered across on many websites and repositories across the United States. A lot of them are in the National Archives, in other archives in the States, and it's one of the reason I mentioned this at the very beginning is that finding the immigrant is one of the most challenging parts of genealogy. And it's just no question that it just becomes tremendously difficult. It becomes very difficult even to identify who the immigrant was, what their real name was. And so this becomes a big challenge. So when you're doing immigrant research, focus on a variety of records. The more records you look at, the more possibilities there are. If you're stuck with birth, marriage, death records, and censuses, you basically are not going to find enough to get this person identified. But you need to go to land and property records, you need to go to probate records, you need to go to newspapers. Every record you find, a Bible record, you never know, just like my marriage record that I found after almost 15 years of research, can contain the actual place of their birth. Could be in the record of a child. It could be in the record of a grandchild. So doing research for the immigrant, if you're serious about finding where these people came, is a process of doing what we call cluster research, looking at their neighbors, their friends, their family, everybody around them, and doing research on all of those people so that you can come up with a consensus of, well, this is where all these people came. So the whole key here, and what's important, is to keep looking, because basically it may be the next record that tells you. But I don't like, one thing I caution, I always try to help people understand, is don't become fixated on trying to find the immigrant, because you may not, the records just may not be available. They could have been indentured, they could have changed their name, they could have been transported, they could have changed their name for purposes of escaping any consequences of having been transported. And so it's very important that you just look at a lot of records, but over time, it's better to come back to it periodically rather than becoming obsessive, because you may very well spend more time that could have been spent productively looking at other people. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Any questions or a comment was made that I don't usually do handouts. Well, all of these presentations are put up online on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel and on the BYU Family History Library website. And so the presentations themselves are the handout. If it's appropriate, if I've cited a whole bunch of citations or links to sources or things like that in a webinar, you can request that you get a PDF copy of the slides if you wish to have it, if that would be helpful to you. But otherwise, it's simple enough if you're watching it to stop the video and copy down the information if it's on a slide. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you again.
All right, thank you, James. Go ahead and close. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on April 27th with Maureen Brady. She will be giving a presentation entitled Using Newspapers to Fill in the Gaps in a Family Story. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.